Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is unprotected attack paths that allow threats to compromise vulnerable targets in the cloud and data center. But traditional microsegmentation is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation, delivering results immediately with a security outcome that's provable and management that's zero touch. Driven by machine learning, Edgewise automatically builds policies that protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network. They provide measurable improvement by quantifying attack path risk reduction and verifying software identity before it communicates to stop application compromises and data breaches. To see how to eliminate your network attack surface, visit securityweekly.com/Edgewise.
Welcome back to Paul Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, sitting in for Paul Asadorian, and I am joined by two co-hosts with me today. First, Mr. Joff Thayer.
G'day, Matt. How are you? Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us for this Aussie special. Also with me is Mr. Lee Neely. Welcome, Lee.
Oh, great to be here. Great to have some friends from across the pond and across the country. Let's have some fun.
We're going to have fun. Speaking of fun, Security Weekly will be at Hacker Halted in Atlanta, Georgia this October 10th and 11th. EC Council is offering our listeners a $100 discount to attend the two-day conference. Use discount code HH19SW when you register, or go to securityweekly.com/hackerhalted and register there. Mr. Paul Asadorian will be giving the keynote, and another co-host, Mr. Jeff Mann, will be talking there as well. So join us in Atlanta. All right, on to our guest interview. Murray Goldschmidt is the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Census Security Down Under in Australia. Murray has over 20 years experience in commercial information security. Prior to co-founding Census Security, he held senior consulting positions at Dimension Data and other leading information security management organizations in South Africa. A recognized industry expert, Murray holds various certifications, including the CISSP, ACSC, IRAP, and PCI SSC QSA. Mr. Jeff Mann would be happy with that. Murray, welcome to Paul Security Weekly.
Thank you for the introduction. Appreciate it.
Yeah, as we've been out looking for additional content, as we've been growing our audience, Paul Ramsden and I got connected, and we thought it would be interesting to bring another perspective from another country to the show. And so thank you for coming. To start, can you give us an overview of Census Security, where you guys are located, et cetera, for the audience?
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I'm joining here from our head office in Sydney, Australia. Census Security is one of the largest pure play cybersecurity advisory firms in the Australian market. We also operate out of an office in Melbourne, and we've got a number of people scattered around the world across Europe. We are a specialist testing company. We provide advisory services, and organizations generally engage us from a compliance perspective to test their systems, their network, their people, their applications, to determine how resilient they are to modern day cyber attacks.
Great. Now, on this segment, we're going to talk distributed denial of service and building out testing programs for distributed denial of service. Let's start a little bit with, what do DDoS attacks look like in 2019? Because when I saw your presentation, I was like, how many people know about the different types of attacks and things that can happen? So can you start with kind of an overview of what do DDoS attacks look like in 2019?
Sure. The type of attacks that are occurring today have actually morphed and changed over a period of time. Unfortunately, today, most people still associate DDoS attacks with high volume, high bandwidth attacks. And those still occur, and those are the ones that make the news headlines because I guess they're sexy and they can throw large numbers at things like a 100 gig or a 5 terabit or whatever it is. That makes a sensational news headline. However, attacks have actually moved well beyond the large volumetric attacks. And the reason for that is that the technology to defeat volumetric attacks is actually pretty good. So the attackers who are wanting to still achieve a denial of service outcome are moving away from performing attacks for which the technology can easily defeat the attack. This means that they're moving the attack towards the application layer. The implication here is that you can actually have a very low volume or a low bandwidth attack, but actually bring a system down. And so the evidence is mounting up that most attacks today are focused at the application layer, where organizations are far more susceptible to denial of service, and the technology or techniques that they're adopting aren't quite as effective at the application layer as they are at the network layer.
And is that because the way the existing DDoS technologies work is they're looking for the large volumes and therefore just, blocking or doing something like that, and they can't detect these kind of lower, slower types of attacks?
Well, there are many different types of technologies on the marketplace. So defeating large volume denial of service attacks generally occurs well before the attack has actually reached your technology, whether it be on-premise technology that you're running in a historical data center, or if you've got a cloud deployment. So those attacks are generally arrested through some sort of global scrubbing center where they distribute the volume of traffic globally and are able to arrest it. The implication with application attacks is that the application is ultimately served by the web server or the application servers that you have implemented. And that means that generally the defense mechanism is much closer to home, much closer to the origin of the server and not the origin of the attack.
Right. And I am assuming a web application firewall isn't the right defense for these types of attacks?
Web application firewalls can be the right defense for some of the attacks. The issue is not really whether or not the technology has got the means to defeat the attack. Most of the issues actually come around from organizations adopting the default settings that vendors set when they deploy their technology. So vendors normally provide technology with a range of features, but they only enable a few of them when in the default settings. And that is because they want to reduce the number of calls to their help desk to make sure that their technology is actually implemented without any problems. And if organizations just adopt the defaults, that means they actually never turn on the settings that will ultimately protect them. So many web application firewalls probably could defeat a number of the types of application attacks that we see occurring out there. Unfortunately, they're never turned on.
Yeah, so back to our lovely conversation around misconfiguration. In this case, it's not configuring these web application firewalls correctly, therefore allowing some of these attacks to actually work on the application itself.
That's right.
So
and of course, it also depends on where the TLS is terminated in your transaction flow. If the web application firewall does not have the ability to actually inspect the traffic because it's still encrypted, then the web application firewall is not going to be able to make any inference as to whether or not it is an attack or not. So you've got to look at the architecture as well as the configuration.
Got it.
Murray,
sorry.
Can I ask a question really quick? Murray, first of all, I think I called you an Aussie earlier, which it sounds like you're South African, but that's neither here nor there. My question for you, though, is you mentioned that low volume attack was more common today in 2019. So can you give a more specific example of that, where some application layer technology is targeted and it is not necessarily a network infrastructure style attack, which we, as you rightly pointed out, are typically used to with distributed denial of service?
Yeah, sure. I'm not certain that application attacks are more common than volumetric attacks. They're becoming more common. So attackers are moving away from the volumetric attack towards something that has got a higher yield or a better return on investment from an attacker's point of view. An example of this would be a website that's got a login form. So most organizations who have got some credentialed component of their web application, you have to log in with a username and a password and possibly a multi-factor authentication component as well. And every single one of those components requires connectivity from the web server to the web application, ultimately to some sort of authentication system or authentication database. And those connections are not unlimited. So you can actually bring down a web server by running multiple invalid login requests, which would bring the authentication system down, which would yield the web application unusable. Another example of a sort of an application style attack is performing an action against a web server for which you know that the firewall is going to block the connection. So the firewalls generally are permitting inbound port 443 or port 80. If you're making connections to a web server on a port other than port 443 or port 80, you will expect that the firewall will block that traffic. But while the firewall is blocking that traffic, it is also actually creating a log entry, because the standards that we have require us to log all inbound and outbound traffic, particularly the denied traffic. So while the firewall is logging denied traffic locally, it will also be logging it probably to some sort of centralized network logging system or SIEM platform. Now, again, those connections are not unlimited. So you can actually bring down a denial of service to both your firewall and your centralized logging system just by creating a condition whereby the firewall will be forced to log blocked traffic, which ultimately doesn't even render on the website, but then the website's no longer able to serve its content.
So what I'm hearing you say then is that we're seeing more of an evolution towards a scalpel versus a sledgehammer sort of approach to potentially use our own defenses against us as a part of a multi-pronged attack.
Absolutely. The attack is moving far more towards finesse and sophistication, and that's because the sledgehammer approach is generally arrested well before that attack reaches your own infrastructure.
Okay, I think Lee had a question, Matt.
Yeah. So I was wondering, when you were talking about, we were talking about the just recently overwhelming the login server, and a couple minutes ago you mentioned that one of the good defense is to actually turn on your web application firewall. And I was remembering back long ago when I was on a web application team, let's not talk about what year that was, where we were playing with web application firewalls, and it was really hard to get those configured right. What's that like in 2019 versus some long interval ago when I had experience?
Well, look, these things basically, the technologies have generally improved over time, and the catch-all default configurations generally have improved, and particularly if you're using a web application firewall that is delivered as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service, the expectation is that the service provider is providing the very best general purpose coverage as a catch-all before you have to get very explicit. So from that perspective, the amount of intricate testing that one has to do has diminished over a period of time. However, if you're trying to protect particular forms on particular pages within your own applications that are very custom and specific to your business, then you do have to get down to a far more granular level. And ultimately, that requires testing and confidence that the types of attacks are actually being arrested by the technology and that you've got visibility of it. So this requires organizations to essentially do purple teaming, which is a combination of red team attacks, which is on the attack side, and blue team defensive. So when you blend red and blue together, you get purple teaming. And ultimately, the best defense comes from organizations who have an investment in purple teaming. That is simulating the attack while also simulating the operational response to identify if they are genuinely able to respond to a modern day cyber attack.
Okay, I was actually going to ask a different question, but when you brought up purple teaming, I'm thinking how many of your customers are actually ready to go there? Is that something that's real for them, or is that too, I don't know, new, esoteric, pitch an adjective? It doesn't matter. Can they relate to it?
I think in our industry, most organizations are still focused on very siloed forms of penetration testing. So they've got an application, it's going live, they'll instruct an external company such as ours to perform a web application pen test, a web service pen test, or a mobile application penetration test. However, the market is generally shifting more towards a risk management viewpoint, and a red team test is essentially a more dynamic, realistic risk assessment of your ability to be cyber resilient. So those more forward-thinking organizations, and luckily for us, the Australian government is very forward-thinking. So the Australian government generally has a perspective of performing these forms of tests, and also the more regulated sectors in our economy. Those who have got a heritage in performing penetration testing and have seen the benefits, but also the limitations of very siloed pen testing, they are the ones that are more generally amenable to extending their budgets to longer duration, more open, less specific pen tests, and that is ultimately what a red team risk assessment is.
So I have a question for Joff. You heard him just describe what's happening in Australia. Do we see the same thing with penetration testing here in the U.S.? Do we see those same trends? I'm just curious.
That's a really good question. I don't think you quite see the same trends occurring in the U.S. And I think some of that is because there's a tremendous legacy of misconfigured technology in the United States, and there's still a lot of appetite out there to do point testing on individual applications. But that doesn't mean it's not starting to happen. But it tends, from my experience working at Black Hills, it's tending to happen in the very high-end sectors, the very high-risk financials particularly, are starting to get a more of an appetite for a longer scale engagement. And we sell a thing we call black teaming. It's just our sort of spin on red/blue that we do sell quite a lot of, and they tend to be the sort of 4-week style engagements. They're still not as long in duration as I would like to see them be, and they're certainly not going to be of the form where a government is driving it. I think it's really interesting what's happening in Australia right now. I don't think the U.S. government is really driving that way in a public sense. I certainly think the DoD world, the military world, has been driving that way for some time, but a lot of that, we can't really talk about.
Yeah, and I think the common component I heard was your higher level customers, which are also probably highly regulated, are more on that path, right? And Murray said the same thing. Because of some of the regulatory requirements, I think more from a government perspective, and Murray, I want your take on this, is they're seeing more adoption of this because it aligns more to that kind of compliance regulatory requirement versus, here in the States where if you're highly regulated, you might be doing this, but for a lot of those industries, maybe you're not.
Well, can I drop one more comment on there, Matt? I think one of the challenges that the U.S. is facing is a little bit of a patchwork of heavily compliance-driven regulatory frameworks, and I think that actually, to some degree, is pushing against the longer term, higher value red team style engagements. There's a lot of, another way to say this is there's a tremendous amount of I've checked the box so that we can move on to the next thing in our compliance list, rather than forward thinking, let's look at a really long style engagement. And I'm not saying that's everybody. We do certainly have, as I just said, the very high end financials that have a broader view of this and are looking at it from much the perspective that Murray was just presenting.
Yeah. So my question now to Murray is that the way it kind of happened in Australia? You saw more of the checkbox do it, but then it's evolved and matured and now creates this environment for these longer term engagements. Did you see the same kind of path? I'm just curious of is that something we'll see more in the States based on the history of maybe the way it happened in Australia?
Yeah. Well, look, I think there are these things operating in parallel. Some organizations are very compliance-centric, and they are still in the motions of checking boxes and making sure that they just meet their obligations. But talking about forward-thinking governments, the Australian government continuously uses the terminology cyber resilience. They expect that the Australian government at a federal level and at a state level to be able to demonstrate cyber resilience. And the expectation amongst the larger corporates within the Australian market, particularly the listed companies, is that they demonstrate the capability to be cyber resilient. And resilient means not necessarily being able to defeat every form of attack, because one can never defeat every single attack that is launched against you. But the importance here is to be able to ensure that you can operate through and still be in business when the attack is over. And so this is where the organizations are leading more towards realistic simulations of cyber attacks. And that's where denial of service testing comes in. Denial of service testing is not penetration testing. Penetration testing is trying to break into something, whereas denial of service testing is to determine your ability to still operate your platforms even when you're under attack. So those organizations that are adopting approach of demonstrating cyber resilience, and it is the expectation again here that the boards of our larger corporates and government are requiring their organizations to demonstrate to them, their stakeholders and their shareholders, that the organization is cyber resilient. And that's where organizations are slowly coming to understand the limitations of point-based pen testing, because you can run a penetration test on a particular application, but that won't give you any confidence about the organization's overall resilience against a range of attacks, which could be social, network, application, denial of service, etc.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, right? It's not about can I pwn the system, it's about can my system survive even a denial of service attack that takes down the website, because it's a very different purview when you think about it from a resiliency perspective than just a penetration into an application.
That's right. Absolutely.
There's another point that I think plays in, and this has been going around in my mind for some time. I have on occasion had clients in Australia. It hasn't happened too often, but there's the one trend that I've noticed, and I think this is true and a good reflection of an Australian talent in general, is I found that the architectures are usually, from my experience anyway, better thought out in Australia than a lot of the architectures that I encounter in the United States. And I don't think that's necessarily a dearth or a lack of talent in the US. I think there is a great pressure of speed to deployment in the States, which tends to result in a lot of that misconfiguration. I don't think the pressure appears to be quite as high in Australia. And there's a bit of anecdotal evidence because I haven't worked actively in Australia for many, many years, but that was sort of my gut feeling on a couple of the occasions that I encountered some clients.
Yeah, Murray, any comments on that? Curious.
Look, the Australian tech, community is generally pretty tech savvy and amenable to testing new technologies. We spoke earlier about high rates of adoption of container technology in the Australian market. Most organizations have already migrated most of their workloads to public cloud technology. Organizations are adopting, large-scale platform as a service email offerings instead of having on-premise offerings in the Australian market as well. And 15 to 20 years ago, Australia was leading in terms of converting physical hardware into virtualized operating system and application stacks. So certainly, the Australian community is very aware of the technology that is out there and does have the inclination to take new technology out and deploy it. This also means that they have to be more observant of the security issues around new technologies, because new technologies are not impervious to hacking or attacks.
Right.
So one specific example I was thinking of that I did encounter, and maybe this is just a point example, but web technology. One of my clients was one of the few that I'd ever encountered that had used client-side certificates for a web application, where I've never encountered that actually in the States at all. You can have mutual certificate authentication in a web app. It's completely possible. It's been possible for a long time. So I think that's reflective of what Murray's saying. Australia is very good at adopting technologies and being very, very active in the tech community.
Yeah, and I guess my question is that why we think they have better architectures, because they are leveraging these new technologies and building a better architecture than a lot of our legacy systems in the States, right? Because they are adopting that technology, and I've seen that trend for years when I was traveling down to Australia.
It's a completely unscientific viewpoint from my perspective. This is just passing view as I see it. But I think that also is a general trend, what you just mentioned, of legacy technologies that tend to weigh people down in the States because they've been there a lot longer, generally. So again, anecdotal, passing viewpoint.
Yeah. Murray, I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that one, but it just seems I've seen this kind of rapid adoption of newer technologies in a country like Australia than I have seen generally in the U.S. Now, granted, we have our examples in the U.S. Don't get me wrong. There are some very highly sophisticated companies that have adopted this new technology and really taken it to scale in various industries. But I'm curious, from an Australia perspective, do you think that's what's driving aspects of these potentially better architectures, because they are so willing to adopt some of these new technologies and really embrace them?
Yes, I think it could be a number of reasons. Clearly, our community is much more concentrated than the US. While the land mass in Australia is about the same size as the US, we've only got a population of 25 million, less than 10% of the American population. So in the US, you've probably got a much wider base to be able to operate across. And as you mentioned, you've got a lot of very sophisticated organizations. Most of the new technologies are actually born in the US. You've got a whole industry around Silicon Valley and other tech businesses. I think it's just in the Australian market that when technology refresh opportunities come through, when your previous round of technology has reached end of life, then Australians look to adopt whatever is the most current and present technology in the marketplace.
Yeah, so that leads me into my next question just quickly, because a couple of the new trends that I think you probably are going to have better insight onto are things around 5G and IoT, for example. I'm curious how those play into DDoS and what you're seeing with adoption of some of those new technologies, because I think you're also on the cusp of some of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, currently most people are using 4G technology, but even before 4G was widely deployed, we could bring down a modern day large corporate financial institutions internet banking page through a 3G mobile phone. Now, the reason for this, as I mentioned before, for example, you've got one component in a web application, such as the login form, which ultimately has got some form of limitation, the number of requests and responses that particular engine can process in a period of time. Now, you can actually overwhelm a web application login page, even if it's authenticating to a common technology such as Active Directory, just through a mobile, through an application running through the bandwidth that is tethered to a 3G mobile phone. So clearly that capability is expanded on 4G and by an order of magnitude when you get to 5G. So the issue here at a low volume attack will be much bigger when you have got a network of phones on a platform such as 5G. But then you will also have to deal not only with the low volume attacks, you'll have to deal with the high volume attacks. And because most 5G technology is ultimately going to be used for streaming of video, media, voice, etc., the footprint and the potential for something to go wrong on a 5G network is exponentially higher.
Yeah, got it. What are you seeing with IoT? I had a lot of conversations on operational technologies when I was traveling to Australia and some of the challenges with OT. Now we see, these IoT and industrial IoT systems coming online. What kind of impact do they have in aspects of DDoS and what you have to prepare for?
Sure. Look, IoT essentially is just a small format computer. There's still an operating system. There's a network interface, either Ethernet, wireless, Bluetooth, or something. And so there's hardware, there's software, there's an operating system, there's some form of application running on it. So it's essentially the same as a web server running on a bigger format computer in a cloud technology. It's just packaged in smaller components. So all of the attacks that occur today can be run in parallel against any network of IoT devices. The big issue here is that because IoT devices generally aren't developed with security in mind, the potential for a botnet to exist once a fleet of IoT devices is compromised is significant. And we've seen this before. The Mirai botnet, for example, has taken over routers, just common home consumer technology routers with default configurations, can actually bring the internet almost to a standstill. So as we get higher proliferation of IoT devices, it's only a matter of time until attackers identify the potential to exploit a fleet of these IoT devices, ultimately creating a botnet, which can then be used to execute distributed denial of service attacks.
Yeah, so low and slow, but highly distributed, because now we're talking millions, if not billions, of potential devices, and so now you have this really broad distributed attack framework out there.
Absolutely. So they could actually be used as the mechanism to launch the attack, but equally they are susceptible to being out of service themselves. So they can be the target of the attack, or they can be the origin of the attack. So if we become more increasingly reliant on IoT devices, particularly commercial IoT devices, for example, those that are controlling traffic systems, temperature, weather regulation, regulating weather in an office environment, environmental conditions, certainly there is the potential that if those things become the target of the attack, then there'll be a great amount of discomfort in the community.
Got it. So there might be some more questions, but I'm curious, how do organizations think about testing against these new types of attacks? What are some of the recommendations on how do you build a testing program to know whether you are resilient to these low, slow, highly distributed types of attacks that we're going to continue to see?
Okay. Well, my perspective on this is that you actually have to understand all the technology that is in your landscape. So I would call this looking at a north-south view of your technology. Identify the systems that ultimately might be a target of an attack. Now, that could be an IoT device, it could be an email server, it could be a web server, DNS, etc. And then work backwards from there. Work out what technology is sitting in front of this. For example, you'll have a switch, you'll have a load balancer, you'll have a firewall, you'll have a router, you'll have a connection to your ISP. You might have some sort of cloud mitigation, DDoS scrubbing technologies, etc. Then identify the extent to which every single one of those technologies, which is in the transaction path all the way to the target, might have the capability to defend against a particular class of attack. So you'll find, for example, that DDoS scrubbing centers have the capability to defeat volumetric attacks, but DDoS scrubbing centers do not have the capability to defeat application layer attacks because they don't have any visibility at the application layer. They're operating much lower on the TCP/IP stack. So if you can identify and class the type of technology that you've got and the type of attack that they might be able to mitigate, you can then identify if they actually have been configured to mitigate that. Remember, the default settings are almost always insecure. They're almost always turned off. So once you've identified the potential for that technology to defeat or mitigate a particular class of attack, you're then going to make sure that it's actually configured to do so, and then actually test it and validate that it's working. So if you can do this all the way from the perimeter of your network at the cloud, all the way to the system that is actually delivering the service or the content, you will have a much greater capability to gain visibility into the full transaction, and then ultimately determine if that technology is working. The next thing, once you've been able to do that, is actually to automate the defense, because manual defenses require actual human intervention to activate the mitigation technology. The issue here is that attacks generally occur late at night, and the people who are in your operating centers in the graveyard shift, between midnight and 6 a.m., are not generally your 5-star sort of security analysts or SOC operators. So relying on manual intervention is not nearly as good as having the sophistication of an automated response once the default configurations have actually been tweaked to provide the coverage that you need.
And if you need expertise, they just should pick up the phone and call you guys and help them out.
Yep, well, we do this for a living. senseofsecurity.com.au.
Got it. Joff, Lee, any additional questions while we have Murray with us?
No, I think I asked all of mine. I'll hand it over to Lee.
And Murray, really, the last question I had was sort of a gap analysis question, which you backed right into answering. Thank you, Murray.
No problem.
Murray, thank you very much for joining us on Paul Security Weekly.
That was a great session.
Thank you, Lee and Joff, and thank you for everyone for watching. We'll see you next week on Paul's Security Weekly.